The virgin mountain man waited for his mail-order bride, but when an obese teen arrived, the shock that rippled through the small mountain community was palpable. The consequences would change lives forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. John Smith stood at the edge of Pine Ridge, his rugged hands trembling as the stagecoach rumbled into town. The wooden wheels kicked up dust that settled on his worn boots. Boots that had carried him up and down the mountain trails for more years than he cared to count. Years of solitude had hardened him, carved lines into his weathered face, but today, his heart pounded like it never had before. After months of correspondence, he was finally meeting the bride he'd sent for, the woman who was supposed to end his lonely vigil on the mountain. The mountain man shifted his weight nervously, adjusting the clean shirt he'd put on for the occasion. He'd spent the morning preparing his cabin, sweeping the floor, and arranging wildflowers in a tin can. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth as they always did, whispering behind their hands. John had grown accustomed to their distance over the years, but today their stares felt heavier, more intrusive. When the stagecoach finally lurched to a stop, the driver secured the reins and jumped down to open the door. A hush fell over the dusty street. The few people milling about on Main Street stopped to watch, their curiosity palpable in the mountain air. Out stepped a teenage girl, Mary Johnson, her face red with embarrassment, her dress pulled tight against her fuller figure. She clutched a worn carpet bag to her chest like a shield, her eyes downcast as she took in her new surroundings. This wasn't the mature widow John had expected from their letters. This was a young girl, barely more than a child, vulnerable and clearly terrified. The silence lasted only moments before it shattered. A group of boys lounging on the boardwalk outside the general store began to snicker. Their laughter spread like wildfire, and soon the entire street seemed to be mocking the unlikely pair. "That's Smith's mail-order bride?" someone called out. "Looks like he got more than he bargained for." Mary's shoulders hunched further, making herself as small as possible, despite her size. Her eyes, when she finally raised them to meet John's, were filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. The look of someone who had faced ridicule before and expected nothing different here. The townspeople's laughter sliced through the silence, turning John's hope into a storm of confusion and shame. He stood frozen, caught between his disappointment and the cruel spectacle unfolding around them. In that moment, something shifted inside him. The mountain man, who had lived alone for so long, who needed no one, felt a surge of protectiveness toward this girl who stood alone against the world's judgment. The boys on the boardwalk pointed and jeered, their laughter cutting through the crisp mountain air like shards of glass. "Look what the stagecoach dragged in," one shouted, nudging his companions. Their cruel words echoed down Pine Ridge's dusty Main Street, drawing more onlookers to the spectacle. Mary Johnson stood frozen beside the coach, her round face flushed crimson with humiliation. Her trembling hands clutched a worn carpet bag containing everything she owned in the world, and a sealed letter from Reverend Miller. Her eyes darted frantically around the gathering crowd, searching desperately for an escape that didn't exist. Each snicker felt like a physical blow, each whispered comment another stone in the wall of shame building around her. John Smith watched from a few paces away, his weathered face a mask of conflicting emotions. This wasn't the bride he had imagined during those long, lonely nights in his mountain cabin. The disappointment crashed through him like an avalanche, followed immediately by a wave of fury at the townsfolk's cruelty. The teenage girl looked terrified, abandoned in a strange place with hostile faces surrounding her. "She's twice the size of what he ordered," someone called out, triggering fresh laughter. A shopkeeper's wife whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Poor man. Imagine being stuck with that on the mountain." John's calloused hands clenched into fists. He had spent years in solitude, working his claim, building his home, speaking more to his mule than to people. He knew what it was to be an outsider, but the naked cruelty directed at this girl stirred something protective within him. Instead of retreating in embarrassment as everyone expected, John straightened his tall frame and strode forward with deliberate steps. The crowd parted before him, their laughter faltering at the determination in his eyes. He reached Mary's side, noting how she flinched slightly at his approach. Without hesitation, he took her small, soft hand in his large, rough one and lifted it high above their heads. His voice, unused to speaking loudly, rang out clear and strong across the street. "This is my bride," he declared, each word weighted with dignity and challenge. The laughter died instantly. A stunned silence fell over the gathered townsfolk, heavy and oppressive as a thundercloud before a storm. John met their stares unflinchingly, his jaw set in defiance. Mary's wide eyes turned to him in disbelief, a single tear tracking down her cheek. In that moment, something shifted between them, a silent promise made in the face of public scorn. Whatever disappointments or complications lay ahead, John had made his choice. He would not abandon her to their mockery. John Smith's weathered hands clenched and unclenched as he studied the girl before him. The mountain man's thoughts tumbled like stones in a spring flood. This trembling child was nothing like the mature widow he'd described in his letters, the companion he'd imagined sharing his solitary life on the ridge. Instead, fate had delivered this frightened teenager, her eyes wide with uncertainty, her frame suggesting she'd known hunger more often than plenty. The sealed envelope from Reverend Miller felt impossibly heavy in Mary Johnson's grasp. John eyed it warily, knowing whatever message it contained would change everything. The preacher had arranged this match, but clearly something had gone terribly wrong. Had the Reverend deceived him, or was there more to this girl's story than met the eye? "Mr. Smith?" Mary's voice barely carried above the wind, fragile as a bird's wing. Her fingers clutched the letter like a lifeline, her other hand still gripping the worn carpet bag that apparently held everything she owned in this world. John nodded stiffly, his throat too dry for words. He reached for her bag, taking it with a gentleness that surprised even himself. Their fingers brushed momentarily, and he noticed how she flinched at the contact, a reflex born of experiences he didn't want to imagine. "That's me," he finally managed, his voice gruff from disuse. Living alone on the mountain didn't require much talking. Behind them, the townsfolk continued their cruel commentary. A group of men outside the general store made no effort to lower their voices as they speculated about what a man like John would want with a girl like Mary. Women whispered behind gloved hands, their judgment clear in narrowed eyes. "Don't listen to them," John said, placing himself between Mary and their stares. "My mule's just over there. It's a long ride up to the cabin." Mary nodded, her eyes downcast. "I can walk if that's better." "No," John replied firmly. "You'll ride. I'll walk alongside." As they moved down Main Street, the jeers followed them like shadows. John felt a protective anger rising in his chest, not just toward the cruel townsfolk, but toward whoever had put this girl in such a desperate situation. He'd lived with loneliness for years, but what had driven her to accept marriage to a stranger in a distant mountain town? John helped Mary onto the mule, noticing how she winced with the effort. Whatever her story, he was determined to shield her from further harm. He might not know how to be a husband, especially to someone so young, but he knew about protection. The mountain had taught him that much. The strong sheltered the vulnerable, or nothing survived. They departed Main Street to the sound of snickering and whispers that clung to them like dust. John Smith's jaw was set in a hard line, his weathered face revealing nothing of the storm brewing inside him. His heart pounded with a peculiar mixture of anger and pity as he helped Mary Johnson onto the mule. The girl's hands trembled as she gripped the saddle, her knuckles white with tension. "Hold tight," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the continued mockery from the townsfolk gathered on the boardwalk. A group of young men made crude gestures, while women whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes sharp with judgment. The mule shifted under Mary's weight, and John noticed how she winced, clearly unused to riding. He adjusted the stirrups without comment, then took the reins and began leading the animal toward the mountain trail. Each step took them further from Pine Ridge, but the shame seemed to follow like a shadow. As the town buildings gradually shrank behind them, a tense silence descended between them. The only sounds were the mule's steady hoofbeats and the occasional call of a bird overhead. John walked with purpose, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, occasionally glancing back to ensure his passenger was secure. Mary tried to make herself as small as possible on the saddle, hunching her shoulders and keeping her gaze downcast. Tears threatened to overflow, but she bit her lip hard, refusing to give in to them. Her carpet bag, containing everything she owned in the world, was clutched tightly against her chest, like a shield. The mountain man stole glances at the girl when he thought she wasn't looking. She was so young, so vulnerable. This wasn't what he had expected when he'd written for a bride. The Reverend's letter burned a hole in his pocket, a sealed message he'd been handed at the stagecoach station but hadn't yet opened. Whatever secrets it contained about this girl and why she'd been sent to him, John wasn't sure he wanted to know. The trail began to steepen, winding through stands of aspen trees, whose leaves trembled in the afternoon breeze. John adjusted his grip on the reins, his calloused hands steady despite his inner turmoil. "It's a long way," he finally said, breaking the silence. "We'll rest at the creek ahead." Mary nodded without looking up, a single tear finally escaping to trace a path down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed. The mountain loomed before them, vast and indifferent to the small human drama unfolding on its slopes. A rugged man and a frightened girl, bound together by circumstances neither had truly chosen. The mountain trail wound upward through a forest of golden aspens, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze like whispered secrets. John Smith led the way, his weathered boots finding the familiar path with practiced ease, while Mary Johnson swayed atop the mule, her fingers clutching the saddle horn with white-knuckled tension. Each step that carried them farther from Pine Ridge brought a measure of relief. The cruel laughter of the townsfolk fading into the mountain silence. Yet as the physical distance from town grew, so did the weight of uncertainty between them. John's broad shoulders were rigid with unspoken thoughts, his mind replaying the scene at the stagecoach again and again. This girl, not the mature widow he'd expected, was now his responsibility. He stole glances at her when he thought she wouldn't notice, taking in her downturned face and the way her body seemed to curl inward, as if trying to disappear. Mary kept her eyes fixed on the mule's mane, mortified by the memory of those jeering boys on the boardwalk. What must this mountain man think of her? The silence stretched between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. After nearly an hour of climbing, they reached a small clearing beside a bubbling stream. John halted, clearing his throat awkwardly. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Mary shook her head quickly. "No, sir," she whispered, though she hadn't eaten since early morning. As if in betrayal, her stomach released a quiet growl. Color rushed to her cheeks as she looked away in embarrassment. John pretended not to notice her discomfort. He reached into his leather pack and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Got some bread here," he said, unwrapping a substantial piece of dark, hearty loaf. "Made it myself. Ain't fancy, but it'll keep you going." He held it out to her, his calloused hands steady and patient. For a long moment, Mary hesitated, then reached out and accepted the offering with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she murmured, taking a small, tentative bite. The bread was dense and slightly sweet, better than she'd expected. Her hunger overcame her shyness, and she took another, larger bite. John nodded with satisfaction and turned to let the mule drink from the stream. As Mary ate, She watched him care for the animal with gentle efficiency. A tiny flicker of hope kindled in her eyes, the first since stepping off that stagecoach. Perhaps this rugged man, with his quiet ways and simple bread, wasn't the monster her stepfather had warned her all men would be. The cabin door creaked shut against the night wind, sealing them into a world of uncertain silence. John Smith moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent years in his own company, stoking the fire until orange flames licked hungrily at the pine logs. The single room filled with dancing shadows that seemed to emphasize its smallness. One rough-hewn table, a single cot against the wall, and little else that spoke of comfort. Mary perched on the edge of the cot, her fingers twisting the fabric of her dress. She made herself as compact as possible, shoulders hunched forward, eyes downcast. The mountain man glanced at her occasionally as he worked, noting how the firelight caught the fear in her expression. "You must be tired," John said, his voice softer than his weathered appearance suggested. "Long journey." Mary nodded, but didn't speak. Her gaze darted around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, the single window with its oiled paper instead of glass. This was to be her home now, this stranger her protector, and the thought made her breath catch in her throat. John reached into his pocket and pulled out the sealed letter she had carried all this way. "This is from Reverend Miller?" he asked, turning the envelope in his calloused hands. "Yes, sir," she whispered, watching him with wide eyes that reflected the firelight. He broke the seal and unfolded the paper, his brow furrowing as he read. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the distant howl of a coyote somewhere on the mountainside. Mary held her breath, knowing that whatever words the page contained would determine her fate. "Your stepfather," John finally said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "He sent you to clear his gambling debts." He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and growing rage. "The Reverend writes that the man has no intention of ever sending for you. He's washed his hands of you entirely." Mary's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She had suspected as much, though hearing it confirmed made her heart sink like a stone. "Did you know?" John asked. "I knew I wasn't wanted," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "But I hoped." The mountain man folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. They sat in silence, two strangers bound by a contract neither had truly chosen. He had wanted a wife, but not a child. She had wanted escape, but not abandonment. "Well," John said finally, rubbing his hand across his face, "we've both been deceived, it seems." He looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "But you're safe here. That's something I can promise." John Smith's hands curled into fists as he paced the small cabin, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The contents of Reverend Miller's letter had ignited a fury inside him that threatened to burst through his weathered exterior. How could a man trade his stepdaughter like cattle to settle a debt? The mountain man had lived alone for years, hardened by solitude, but this injustice pierced through his calloused heart. He glanced at Mary, perched on the edge of his only chair, her shoulders hunched forward, as silent tears carved paths down her round cheeks. The townsfolk's cruel laughter still echoed in his mind, their mockery of her size, their whispers about her youth. John felt shame creep up his neck, remembering how he expected a mature widow, not this frightened girl barely past childhood. "I'll take you to Cedar Ridge tomorrow if you want," he offered gruffly, his voice unused to comfort. "You shouldn't have to stay here against your will." Mary looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "Please don't send me back," she whispered. "My stepfather will just sell me to someone worse." The plea in her voice struck him like a physical blow. John ran a hand through his hair, suddenly aware of how threatening his tall frame must appear to her. He deliberately softened his stance, moving slowly as he stoked the fire. "Nobody's selling anybody," he declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. "That ain't how things work up here on the mountain." The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of pine logs in the fireplace. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its lonely sound mirroring the isolation that surrounded them both. John cleared his throat. "You take the cot," he said, gesturing to the simple bed in the corner. "I'll sleep here by the door." He pulled a worn blanket from a trunk and spread it on the floor, creating a makeshift bed that established a clear boundary between them. "You're safe here," he added softly, meaning every word. "I give you my word on that." Mary watched him in the flickering firelight, her expression a battlefield of emotions, uncertainty warring with gratitude, fear slowly giving way to tentative trust. She nodded slightly, clutching the quilt he'd offered to her chest, like armor. As John settled onto his hard floor bed, he realized with sudden clarity that his duty now extended beyond mere hospitality. This girl needed protection, from her stepfather, from the railroad's claim, from the cruelty of strangers. And perhaps, he thought as sleep began to claim him, they both needed something neither had expected to find on this mountain: respect, purpose, and a chance to heal. Dawn broke over the mountain with a crisp, golden light that filtered through the cabin's single window. John Smith rose from his makeshift bed on the floor, his muscles stiff from the hard wooden planks. The night had been long, filled with thoughts about the strange situation fate had thrust upon him. He moved with deliberate purpose, each action a defense against the awkwardness that hung in the air like morning mist. Outside, frost crunched beneath his boots as he split logs with practiced swings. The physical labor was a relief, something familiar in a world suddenly turned unfamiliar. When he returned, arms laden with firewood, he stoked the dying embers and set coffee to boil in the battered pot that had been his only companion for meals these past years. The aroma of brewing coffee filled the small space, rich and inviting. John glanced occasionally toward the corner where Mary slept. Her slight form curled beneath his spare blanket. He moved quietly, not wanting to disturb her rest, yet part of him hoped she would wake. The silence felt heavier than the mountain itself. As if answering his unspoken wish, Mary stirred. She sat up slowly, her hair disheveled, eyes wary as she took in her surroundings. For a moment, confusion clouded her features before yesterday's memories visibly settled upon her shoulders. "Morning," John offered gruffly, pouring a cup of the steaming liquid. Mary smoothed her dress and approached the small table hesitantly. "Can I help?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John nodded, relieved at the broken silence. "You know how to make biscuits?" He showed her where he kept the flour and lard, demonstrating how he mixed them together. Mary's hands took over, moving with a quiet confidence that surprised him. Her fingers worked the dough with practiced ease, a skill clearly remembered from happier times. "My mother taught me," she explained softly, not looking up, "before she passed." John watched as something changed in her expression, a small spark of pride pushing through the shame that had shrouded her since stepping off the stagecoach. Her movements became more assured as she shaped the dough into rounds. "These'll be better than mine," he admitted, setting out a pan. A ghost of a smile touched Mary's lips. "We had to make do with little," she said. "But Mama always said good biscuits make any table seem richer." As the biscuits baked in the small stove, filling the cabin with their comforting scent, John realized that in this small moment of domestic tranquility, something fundamental had shifted between them. Not friendship exactly. Not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. The morning dew still clung to the grass as John Smith led Mary toward the spring. The mountain air was crisp, filling their lungs with its sweet freshness as they followed a narrow path that wound through a stand of aspens. "Water's the lifeblood up here," John explained, his voice gentler than Mary had heard before. "This spring never runs dry, even in the harshest summer." Mary nodded, taking in every word. The mountain man knelt beside the clear pool, showing her how to fill the wooden buckets without stirring up sediment. His large hands moved with surprising grace, demonstrating the proper technique. "Your turn," he said, stepping back. Mary knelt where he had been, mimicking his movements. Her first attempt sent ripples across the surface, clouding the water slightly. But John didn't criticize. Instead, he waited patiently until the water cleared. "That's it," he encouraged when she tried again with better results. "Nice and slow." With both buckets filled to the brim, they began the journey back to the cabin. The weight pulled at Mary's arms, making each step a challenge. John carried his load effortlessly, but slowed his pace to match hers. Halfway up the trail, Mary's foot caught on a root. She stumbled forward, water sloshing over the rim of her bucket. Before she could fall, John's steady hand caught her elbow, stabilizing her with just enough strength to keep her upright. "I'm sorry," she whispered, embarrassed by her clumsiness. "Nothing to be sorry for," he replied. "Took me months to learn these paths." Back at the cabin, John showed her how to store the water in the large barrel by the door. Throughout the day, he introduced her to more mountain tasks, chopping kindling with the small axe, feeding the old mule that grazed behind the cabin, and mixing dough for bread with flour from the general store in Pine Ridge. Mary approached each task with determination, her face set in concentration. When the kindling split perfectly under her careful stroke, John nodded approvingly. When she approached the mule with trepidation but didn't back away, he smiled. And when her first loaf of bread emerged from the oven, golden and fragrant, something close to pride flickered across his weathered features. As evening approached, Mary sat by the fire, her hands red and raw from the day's work, but her spirit lighter. John sat across from her, whittling a piece of pine wood. The silence between them no longer tense, but comfortable. "You did well today," he said finally, looking up from his work. The simple words warmed Mary more than the fire. For the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she felt something other than shame. A tentative hope that perhaps she could belong here, on this mountain, in this strange new life. The crackle of twigs outside the cabin door broke the comfortable silence that had settled between John and Mary over the past week. John Smith's hand instinctively moved toward his rifle as he rose from his chair. Mary looked up from the biscuit dough she was kneading, her eyes wide with apprehension. A sharp knock followed, and John opened the door to find a well-dressed man standing on his porch. The stranger's polished boots and crisp suit looked jarringly out of place against the rugged mountain backdrop. "John Smith?" the man inquired, his voice smooth as river stones. "Thomas Davis, claim agent for the Western Railroad Company." He tipped his hat toward Mary, who shrank back slightly. John nodded curtly, keeping his body positioned between the visitor and Mary. "What brings railroad business up the mountain?" Thomas produced a leather portfolio from his satchel. "I'm afraid I'm here on a rather delicate matter concerning Miss Johnson." He emphasized her maiden name deliberately. "Her stepfather entered into a binding agreement with our company. She was to work off his considerable debts through service to the railroad." Mary's hands froze in the dough, flour dusting her trembling fingers. "That can't be true," she whispered. The claim agent laid several official-looking papers on the table. "I'm afraid it is, my dear. Unless, of course, you can provide proof of a lawful marriage that would supersede the prior claim." John's throat tightened as realization dawned. He had no marriage license, nothing official to show. Only the public declaration he'd made in town, and the Reverend's letter explaining Mary's circumstances. "We're married in the eyes of God and the community," John stated firmly. Thomas smiled thinly. "The courts require more than intentions, Mr. Smith. Without proper documentation, I'm authorized to take Miss Johnson to fulfill her stepfather's contract." Mary's face drained of color. John stepped forward, his weathered hands clenched at his sides. "You'll do no such thing." "I'm a reasonable man," Thomas replied, adjusting his cuffs. I'll give you 3 weeks to produce the necessary proof, a marriage license, testimony, documentation of Miss Johnson's age. Otherwise, I'll return with the sheriff." After the claim agent departed, John found Mary staring blankly at the half-finished biscuits, tears streaming silently down her face. "He can't take me, can he?" she asked, her voice barely audible. John knelt beside her, taking her flour-covered hands in his. "No one's taking you anywhere," he promised, though uncertainty gnawed at him. "We'll ride to town tomorrow. Reverend Miller will help us." That night, neither slept. John paced the cabin floor while Mary lay awake, both haunted by the ticking clock that had suddenly been placed on their fragile peace. 3 weeks to prove what they both knew in their hearts was true, or lose everything they'd begun to build together. The mountain air bit sharper than usual as John Smith and Mary Johnson made their way down the winding trail toward Pine Ridge. Their mule trudged steadily beneath them, carrying both riders with reluctant patience. John had risen before dawn, his mind too troubled for sleep, while Mary had barely touched the breakfast he'd prepared. "We'll get this sorted," John said, his voice low but firm. The girl nodded, though her eyes betrayed her fear. Main Street appeared much as it had when Mary first arrived, dusty, unwelcoming, and filled with prying eyes. Shopkeepers paused their sweeping, women whispered behind gloved hands, and children pointed without shame. Mary's cheeks flushed crimson, her body instinctively curling inward, as if to make herself invisible. Yet beside her, John walked with his shoulders squared and head high, his weathered face a mask of determination. "Don't look at them," he murmured. "They don't matter today." The church stood at the edge of town, its white steeple reaching toward heaven like a finger of hope. Reverend Miller greeted them at the door, his kind eyes crinkling with concern as he ushered them inside, away from the town's judgment. "Thomas Davis came to see me yesterday," the preacher said, settling behind his modest desk. "He seems quite determined." John's fists clenched. "He has no right to her." The Reverend nodded, pulling open a drawer to retrieve several folded papers. "I have the letters we exchanged regarding your request for a bride. And here," he said, producing another document, "is my record of your public declaration when Mary arrived." Mary sat silently, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Will it be enough?" John asked. Reverend Miller's expression grew grave. "I fear not. Judge Anderson is a stickler for legal procedure. You'll need a proper marriage license, documentation of Mary's age to prove she's of legal age to consent, and sworn testimony from witnesses who can verify your relationship is legitimate. And not," he hesitated, glancing at Mary, "not what some in town have implied. My stepfather sent me away," Mary spoke suddenly, her voice small but clear. "He never meant for me to have a real marriage." The Reverend reached across to pat her hand. "I know, child, and that's why we must prove your union with John is lawful and true." "What happens if we can't?" John asked, though he feared he knew the answer. "Then the railroad's claim will stand. They'll take Mary as payment for the debt, likely as a kitchen servant or laundress at one of their work camps." The preacher's voice hardened. "Those places are no place for a young woman alone." John stood, his shadow falling across the desk. "That won't happen. I made her a promise." Mary looked up at him, gratitude and something deeper shining in her eyes. For the first time since the claim agent's arrival, she allowed herself to hope that this mountain man, this stranger who had become her protector, might truly save her from a fate worse than the one she'd fled. Mary Johnson spent the night in the modest back room of Reverend Miller's house, where his wife had prepared a small cot with fresh linens. Despite the woman's kindness, Mary couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with visions of being dragged away to work off her stepfather's debts. She clutched the thin blanket, wondering if this brief taste of kindness with John would be all she ever knew of freedom. Across the churchyard, John Smith tossed restlessly on a bed of hay in the stable. The horse's gentle breathing did little to calm his troubled thoughts. He had promised to protect this girl who had arrived so unexpectedly in his life. Now, facing the cold reality of the law, he feared his word might not be enough. The mountain man who had faced bears and blizzards found himself terrified of failing the trust Mary had placed in him. At first light, they met in the church. John wore his only good shirt, freshly pressed by the Reverend's wife, while Mary appeared in a borrowed dress, her hair neatly braided. They barely spoke, the weight of the day ahead hanging between them. "You ready?" John finally asked, his voice softer than usual. Mary nodded, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. The courthouse stood imposingly at the end of Main Street, its wooden steps worn from years of townspeople seeking justice. Inside, Judge Anderson sat behind a massive oak desk, his gray beard and stern eyes giving him the appearance of a man who had seen every deception possible. Thomas Davis arrived in a tailored suit, confidence radiating from his polished appearance. The claim agent placed a document on the judge's desk with theatrical precision. "Your Honor, I have here a legally binding contract signed by Mary Johnson's stepfather," Thomas announced, his voice carrying throughout the small courtroom. "The girl was offered as payment for significant debts. The railroad has a rightful claim to her services." The judge examined the paper carefully before turning to John. "And what do you say to this, Mr. Smith?" John stood tall, his calloused hands clasped before him. "I sent for a bride, Your Honor. I didn't know Mary's age when she arrived, but I made a vow before God and the whole town to care for her." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I aim to protect her, not because of any paper, but because it's the right thing to do." Mary watched him, hope and fear battling in her heart. Judge Anderson listened impassively before setting down his spectacles. "The law requires more than good intentions, Mr. Smith. I need proof of your marriage and evidence of Miss Johnson's legal status within 3 weeks." His gavel struck with finality. "Until then, this case remains open." The journey back to the mountain cabin stretched in silence, broken only by the rhythmic plodding of the mule's hooves on the dusty trail. John Smith's broad shoulders were set with determination, his weathered face masking the worry that gnawed at his insides. Beside him, Mary Johnson kept her eyes fixed on the path ahead, her small hands clutching the saddle horn. "We'll find someone," John finally said, his voice rough with emotion. "Someone who knew your mother, who can testify about when you were born." He reached up to steady Mary as the mule navigated a particularly rocky section of the trail. Mary nodded, trying to believe him. "My mother had a friend in Cedar Ridge," she whispered. "They wrote letters for years, even after we moved away. She might remember." The mountain man's eyes brightened slightly. "That's good. That's something we can use." Back at the cabin, they fell into a routine tinged with urgency. Each morning, John would ride to neighboring homesteads, asking about anyone who might have known Mary's family. He returned each evening dusty and tired, but never defeated. "The Hendersons think they might have crossed paths with your mother once," he reported one night over a simple supper of beans and cornbread. "Not enough for testimony, but they mentioned others who might help." Mary spent her days writing letters, her handwriting, neat and small, filled page after page as she reached out to anyone who might remember her birth. She wrote to shopkeepers in towns her family had passed through, to her mother's old church, and finally, to Mrs. Eleanor Winters in Cedar Ridge, her mother's dearest friend. "Do you think she'll answer in time?" Mary asked as she sealed the envelope with a drop of candle wax. John took the letter gently. "I'll ride out tomorrow and make sure it gets on the next mail coach." His calloused fingers brushed against hers, and neither pulled away. The days that followed were a strange mixture of dread and hope. They continued their daily tasks, hauling water from the spring, tending the small garden, mending clothes, but always with the weight of Thomas Davis's threat hanging over them. At night, they would sit by the fire, John carving wood while Mary darned socks, discussing what they would say at the hearing. Sometimes, when fear threatened to overwhelm her, Mary would find John watching her with such fierce protectiveness that her courage would return. "If the letter doesn't come in time," she said one evening, her voice barely audible, What will happen to me? The mountain man set down his carving knife. I won't let them take you, he promised, the firelight reflecting in his determined eyes. Not while I have breath in my body. Mary believed him. Against all reason, against the weight of the law and Thomas Davis's claims, she believed him. Despite the looming threat from the railroad, life on the mountain homestead carried on with its own rhythm. John Smith insisted that Mary learn to handle his hunting rifle, believing firmly that every mountain dweller needed to defend themselves. "What if I'm not here?" he asked one crisp morning as they stood behind the cabin. "You need to know how to protect yourself." Mary Johnson's hands trembled as she first held the heavy weapon. The cold metal felt foreign against her palms, and the thought of firing it terrified her. John stood behind her, his voice gentle but firm as he guided her arms into position. "Breathe slow," he instructed, his calloused hands steadying her shoulders. "Look down the barrel, not at it." The first shot sent her stumbling backward into his chest, the explosion louder than she'd expected. But day by day, her confidence grew. By the end of the week, she could hit a can placed on a stump 20 yards away, her aim becoming as steady as her resolve. "My father would never have believed a girl could shoot like this," she said one afternoon, pride evident in her voice. John nodded, a rare smile crossing his weathered face. "Most men don't know what women are capable of. That's their mistake." In return for these lessons, Mary taught John skills from her own life. She showed him how to properly mend his shirts, which had always been roughly patched with uneven stitches. "My mother taught me this before she passed," Mary explained, demonstrating how to make nearly invisible repairs to a torn sleeve. "She said a well-mended garment shows care for what you have." John watched her nimble fingers work, fascinated by her precision. Later, she taught him to bake sweetbread, a recipe she'd learned as a child. The cabin filled with the aroma of cinnamon and honey as they worked side by side, flour dusting their clothes. "This is the first time I've baked since coming to Pine Ridge," she admitted, kneading the dough with newfound confidence. "It reminds me of happier times." Each evening, they sat by the fire, sharing stories of their days before they'd met. John spoke of hunting expeditions and winter storms. Mary recalled her mother's songs and the garden they'd tended together before sorrow had darkened her childhood. These quiet exchanges, punctuated by occasional laughter and comfortable silences, wove invisible threads between them. Neither mentioned the approaching court date or Thomas Davis's threats, but both felt stronger facing them together than they ever would have alone. The mountain air carried the scent of cinnamon and apples as Mary Johnson set her freshly baked pies on the church's outdoor table. Sunday gatherings had once been a source of dread, but 3 weeks of determined effort had begun to shift the tide of public opinion. Several women approached, their previous sneers replaced with curious glances. "These look delightful," Mrs. Peterson said, cutting into the golden crust. The first bite drew a surprised smile. "Why, this is better than mine," Mary blushed, smoothing her dress self-consciously. Across the churchyard, John Smith watched with quiet pride. The mountain man stood taller these days, his usual stoic demeanor softening whenever his gaze fell upon the young woman who was changing his life. When a group of teenage boys began snickering behind their hands, pointing in Mary's direction, John didn't hesitate. He crossed the yard in long strides, positioning himself between them and his bride. "Something amusing, you boys?" he asked, his voice low but carrying enough to draw attention. The tallest boy shuffled his feet, suddenly finding the dirt fascinating. "No, sir," he mumbled. "Good, because that woman there makes the best apple pie in Pine Ridge, and a man with any sense would show proper respect." John's words weren't just a rebuke. They were a declaration of pride. The Reverend witnessed the exchange, nodding approvingly. Later, he clapped John on the shoulder. "You're both finding your place here," Reverend Miller observed. "It takes courage to stand against cruelty." That evening, storm clouds gathered over the mountains. Rain lashed against the cabin windows as thunder rolled through the valley. Mary sat near the fire, attempting to untangle her hair with broken fingers of her old comb. "Here," John said, his voice barely audible above the storm. From behind his back, he produced a wooden comb, its teeth smooth and evenly spaced, the handle carved with delicate pine branches. "Made it last week. Been waiting for the right time." Mary took the gift with trembling hands. The craftsmanship spoke of hours of patient work, each detail lovingly shaped by the same calloused fingers that split wood and fired rifles. "You made this? For me?" she whispered. John nodded, suddenly awkward. "Noticed yours was breaking." Tears welled in Mary's eyes, spilling onto her cheeks. Unlike the tears of shame she'd shed upon arriving in Pine Ridge, these came from a place of wonder. She ran her fingers over the pine pattern, understanding the significance, this mountain, this home, this man, all becoming part of her story. "Thank you," she said simply. For the first time since arriving on the mountain, Mary felt not merely sheltered, but cherished. The wooden comb represented more than a practical gift. It was tangible proof that someone saw her worth. The courthouse date was circled in charcoal on the cabin wall, a looming shadow over their days. John Smith and Mary worked with quiet determination, preparing themselves for the battle that would determine their future. Each evening after chores were complete, they rehearsed what they would say before Judge Anderson, their words becoming more confident with each practice. "You'll need something proper to wear," John told Mary one evening, his weathered face softening as he counted out the few dollars he'd saved. The next day, Reverend Miller's wife invited Mary to the parsonage, where she helped the girl sew a new dress from pale blue calico. The older woman's fingers guided Mary's through the stitches, teaching her the patient art of creating something beautiful from simple cloth. "You have worth beyond what those people see," the Reverend's wife whispered as they worked. "Remember that when you stand before the judge." Meanwhile, John spent hours polishing his worn leather boots until they gleamed in the firelight. He trimmed his beard and mended the tear in his only good shirt. These small acts of preparation were his armor against the coming storm. 3 days before the hearing, a neighbor rode up the mountain trail, his horse lathered from the climb. He carried a letter that made Mary's hands tremble as she read it. Her mother's childhood friend from Cedar Ridge had written, confirming Mary's birth date and circumstances. The woman remembered holding baby Mary and promised to testify if needed. "This could save us," Mary whispered, clutching the paper to her chest. John nodded, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time in weeks. The night before the hearing, neither slept well. Mary tossed on the cot while John stared at the cabin ceiling, his mind racing through every possible outcome. By dawn, they were both exhausted but resolute. They rode the mule down the mountain as the sun crested the pines. Mary sat behind John, her new dress carefully folded in her carpet bag, her heart pounding against her ribs. The letter from Cedar Ridge was tucked safely in John's pocket, pressed against his chest like a talisman. As they approached Pine Ridge, they could see townsfolk already gathering outside the courthouse. Some pointed as they passed, whispering behind cupped hands. Others nodded respectfully, having witnessed the couple's quiet dignity over recent weeks. "They're just hungry for scandal," John said softly, helping Mary down from the mule. "But we know the truth." Mary straightened her shoulders and took John's calloused hand in hers. Together, they walked toward the courthouse steps, neither bowing their heads nor rushing their pace. Whatever judgment awaited them inside, they would face it standing tall. Two souls who had found in each other the strength to defy a world determined to break them. The courthouse buzzed with tension as every seat filled with townsfolk eager to witness the culmination of what had become Pine Ridge's most talked-about scandal. Judge Anderson's gavel brought the room to attention, his weathered face revealing nothing as he called the proceedings to order. Thomas Davis approached the bench with practiced confidence, his polished boots clicking against the wooden floor. The claim agent unfurled the contract with theatrical precision, pointing to Mary's stepfather's signature with a manicured finger. "Your Honor, this girl is legally bound to fulfill her stepfather's debt to the railroad," Thomas declared. "The law is clear on this matter. She was transferred as payment, and Mr. Smith has no legitimate claim to her." John Smith rose slowly, his calloused hands resting on the table before him. The mountain man's voice, rarely heard in town before Mary's arrival, filled the courtroom with unexpected eloquence. "I've lived alone on that mountain for 15 years, he began, his eyes meeting the judge's without wavering. "I wrote for a companion, yes, but when Mary stepped off that stagecoach and these people laughed, something changed in me." He glanced at the girl beside him. "I saw dignity where others saw shame. I made a vow before God and these witnesses to protect her." Mary Johnson stood trembling beside the man who had become her protector. Her hands clutched the edge of her newly sewn dress as she gathered courage to speak. "My stepfather sold me like cattle," she said, her voice initially faint, but growing stronger with each word. "He never told me where I was going or why. But John," she looked up at him, gratitude shining in her eyes, "he gave me safety when no one else would. He taught me to defend myself, to be strong." Reverend Miller approached the bench next, Bible in hand. The preacher's testimony carried the weight of moral authority as he presented the letters, documenting their correspondence and Mary's arrival. "I've witnessed the transformation of two souls finding purpose in each other," the Reverend stated firmly. "What began as a transaction has become something sacred." Judge Anderson studied the documents before him, his brow furrowed in concentration. The courtroom held its breath as he compared Thomas's contract with the Reverend's letters and the testimony from Mary's mother's friend in Cedar Ridge. The judge's eyes moved between the legal papers and the couple standing before him, a man and young woman whose unlikely union had somehow withstood ridicule, threat, and uncertainty. In that moment, the choice before him transcended mere legality. It was a judgment between what was written and what was true, between the letter of the law and its spirit. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Anderson shuffled his papers, his weathered face betraying nothing of his thoughts. John Smith's calloused hand found Mary's trembling one beneath the wooden table, squeezing gently. The packed room held its collective breath, townspeople leaning forward on rough-hewn benches. Having reviewed all evidence presented, the judge began, his voice filling the hushed courthouse. "I find several disturbing irregularities in the documents submitted by the railroad." He fixed Thomas Davis with a stern gaze. "These papers, purporting to claim Miss Johnson as payment for debt, show clear signs of forgery." Thomas rose to object, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. Furthermore, Reverend Miller's testimony regarding the circumstances of Miss Johnson's arrival, combined with the letter from her mother's friend in Cedar Ridge confirming her birth date, establishes both her legal age and the legitimacy of her union with Mr. Smith. Mary's eyes filled with tears as hope bloomed within her chest. The judge continued, his tone growing firmer as he addressed the claim agent directly. "This court hereby declares the marriage between John Smith and Mary Johnson lawful and binding under territorial law." He brought his gavel down with finality. "Miss Johnson will remain with her husband, and you, Mr. Davis, are warned never to return to this jurisdiction with falsified claims." The sound of the gavel echoed through the room like thunder breaking a drought. For a moment, silence reigned. Then a single clap from Reverend Miller sparked a wave of applause that swept through the courtroom. Even those who had once mocked the couple joined in, shame and newfound respect mingling on their faces. Thomas stormed from the courthouse, his expensive boots kicking up dust as he retreated toward the stagecoach office. John stood slowly, disbelief giving way to profound relief as he helped Mary to her feet. She wiped away tears with trembling fingers, her smile breaking through like sunshine after rain. "It's over," John whispered, his usually reserved face transformed by joy. "You're free." The Reverend approached them, clasping John's shoulder firmly. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, smiling warmly at the couple. "What began in mockery has ended in justice." Townspeople who had once snickered behind their hands now came forward to offer congratulations. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, embraced Mary warmly. "You must come by the shop tomorrow," she insisted. "I've been wanting to share my apple pie recipe with someone who appreciates good baking." As they stepped out into the bright mountain sunshine, John and Mary paused on the courthouse steps. The town below them no longer seemed hostile, but welcoming, a place where they might someday belong. With dignity restored and their future secured, they began the journey home, walking taller than they had arrived. The mountain air carried the scent of pine and celebration as neighbors arrived at John and Mary's cabin, arms laden with dishes of steaming food and warm smiles. Reverend Miller and his wife were among the first to arrive, bringing a freshly baked apple pie and heartfelt congratulations. The small home that had once been a place of uncertainty now buzzed with laughter and fellowship. Mary Johnson moved through the gathering with newfound confidence, accepting embraces from women who had once whispered behind her back. Her cheeks flushed, not with shame, but with joy as she served the food she had prepared. John watched her from across the room, his weathered face softening with pride. "You've got yourself a fine home here," one of the miners remarked, clapping John on the shoulder. "And a mighty fine wife, too." John nodded, unable to find words for the fullness in his heart. Just months ago, he had stood alone on this mountain, his days marked only by solitude and work. Now, the cabin glowed with warmth and purpose. As twilight deepened, someone produced a fiddle. The furniture was pushed aside, and neighbors danced on the wooden floor John had laid with his own hands. Mary laughed as an elderly woman showed her the steps to a country dance, her movements growing more confident with each turn. When darkness fell completely, they gathered outside, lanterns hung from tree branches casting golden light on faces turned upward to the vast canopy of stars. They sang hymns that echoed through the valley, voices blending in harmony that seemed to reach toward heaven itself. "I never thought I'd belong anywhere again," Mary whispered to John as they stood side by side, watching their neighbors depart down the mountain trail, lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the distance. Later, in the quiet of their home, John and Mary knelt together beside the hearth. The mountain man who had rarely spoken to God now found words of gratitude flowing easily. Mary's soft voice joined his, giving thanks for the mercy that had brought them together and the strength that had seen them through their trial. The firelight danced across their joined hands, his large and calloused from years of labor, hers smaller but equally strong in their own way. As the flames cast shadows on the cabin walls, a profound peace settled between them. "Whatever comes," John said softly, "we face it together." Mary squeezed his hand in response, knowing that in this place, with this man, she had found not just shelter, but home. The love that had taken root in their hearts had transformed them both, proving that even in the harshest wilderness, grace could bloom and flourish. The seasons turned like pages of a well-worn book, each one writing a new chapter in the story of John Smith and Mary Johnson's mountain home. Their cabin, once a lonely outpost, now stood as a testament to shared dreams. The garden that Mary tended flourished with vegetables and wildflowers, her gentle hands coaxing life from soil that many had deemed too harsh for beauty. John's laughter, once a rare sound, now echoed through the cabin walls as he shared tales of his youth, adventures in distant mountains, and quiet moments under star-filled skies. The man who had stood rigid with disappointment on that fateful day at the stagecoach now moved with the ease of someone who had found his place in the world. "Tell me again about the bear cub," Mary would ask, her eyes bright with affection as she kneaded dough for their evening bread. And John would oblige, his voice warm with memory, as he described the orphaned cub he'd once rescued and returned to the wild. On Sundays, neighbors who had once sneered now traveled up the mountain trail, bringing preserves and news from town. They gathered in the clearing by the cabin, sharing worship and slices of Mary's famous apple pie. Children who had never known the cruelty of that first day played freely around the homestead, learning from John how to identify animal tracks and from Mary how to weave baskets from mountain grasses. Reverend Miller visited regularly, his weathered Bible tucked under his arm. "You've built something special here," he told them one evening, watching as firelight danced across their faces. "Something that gives others courage." Even Judge Anderson made the journey once, marveling at how the shy girl and solitary mountain man had transformed not just their lives, but the spirit of Pine Ridge itself. As autumn painted the aspens gold that year, John and Mary stood at the edge of their property, watching leaves dance in the wind. The mountain that had once seemed to echo John's isolation now embraced them both in its ancient arms. He squeezed her hand, calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "No one is unwanted here," he whispered, the words carrying all the weight of their journey. Mary leaned against his shoulder, her heart full. "Not even us," she replied softly. Their hearts, once battered by shame and fear, now beat together in the shelter of love they had built timber by timber, day by day. The wilderness that had witnessed their struggle now stood as silent guardian to their joy, proving that even in the rockiest soil, grace could take root and transform everything, even two souls the world had once deemed unworthy of belonging.